use. So that doesn't provide you maybe a regular every week if you want to go to the same place kind of thing.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you today. Good afternoon. Yes, that is a dog in the background. I apologize for him. He always wants to be involved. Good afternoon again. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations at Johns Hopkins. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the SNF Agora Institute and the Hopkins Alumni in Law Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to our speakers and introduce our moderator, I encourage you to ask questions in the Zoom Q&A located at the bottom of your screen. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Camille Fesh, an attorney and co-chair of the Government Relations and Lobbying Division of Rifkin, Wiener, Livingston, LLC. Camille is also a very active Hopkins alumna and wonderful volunteer. So Camille, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Jamie, thank you very much for your kind words. I'll be introducing Mr. Ruckman. Stephen Ruckman is Deputy Director of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, where he works closely with the director and team to advance the Institute's research and teaching missions and support all of Institute efforts to strengthen democracy. Prior to joining the Institute, he held a number of policy roles in the government and nonprofit sectors, most recently serving as JHU's Senior Advisor to the President for Policy. Mr. Ruckman is a graduate of Amherst College and holds a JD from Yale Law School, along with a Master of Arts in Religion from the Yale Divinity School. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Camille, and thank you for that introduction. And I'm excited to introduce Bill McCollum and hopefully Congressman Raskin as well. We'll make sure we introduce him when he comes on the line, but this is a meaty topic, so Bill and I am sure we'll be able to cover a lot of ground. Bill McCollum represented Florida's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1981 to 2001, serving on the Judiciary, Banking and Financial Services, and Intelligence Committees. While in Congress, he served as House Manager for President Bill Clinton's impeachment trial, and he went on to become Florida's Attorney General, serving in that capacity from 2007 to 2011, representing the state in a lot of very important matters before the courts. And he is currently a partner at Denton's, where he co-chairs its state attorney general practice. So welcome, General McCollum.
Well, thank you. Glad to be with you. It's my pleasure.
General McCollum, I think we should just jump right in. And I think one important thing to just work out for our audience is, impeachment has been in headline news all year. But I think a lot of folks still don't have a clear understanding of the impeachment process and the roles that the House and Senate play. So, I was hoping you could just offer a brief overview of that process because you have the experience.
Well, I'm happy to do that. And I do have a little frog in my throat, so I apologize. You never know when I'm in the mountains of New Mexico today, as I think you know, but your guests and audience may not. And so, but anyway, I think I've got the frog on, and the impeachment process is something in the Constitution where the House of Representatives may vote to impeach not only the president, but judges and other officials of bribery, treason, high crimes and misdemeanors. There is a process for doing that. They draw up the articles, they present whatever the vote has to be with a full House. And if you have a majority vote for impeachment, it goes to the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate has the full authority to try the impeachment case. That is something where they make up the rules. We don't have the rules. There's not like a trial in the real court of law. We have a judge in a way. We have the Supreme Court Chief Justice who presides, and it's always awkward because he's not always sure of his role. We have a few precedents on this, but as I've seen in the past 2 or 3 times we've had impeachment trials, they aren't always followed. The Senate's going to do whatever it wants to do, because nothing in the Constitution tells them otherwise. So they try the case. They can or could not have witnesses, up to them. They look at all the evidence, and they can I believe they can dismiss it, but they certainly can try. They can acquit. They can say the president's not guilty of the articles that he's charged with. If they convict, on the other hand, then the president is subject to removal from office. He is removed from office at that point. And they could have a vote to bar or ban any of these officers, particularly the president, from ever running for office, federal office again. I don't think that has never occurred, but that is a possibility. So that's sort of the general outline.
Thank you so much, General McCollum, and really excited that Congressman Raskin is with us too. Congressman Raskin, we just got started, and it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. And I gave a quick introduction for Bill. I'll give a quick introduction for you. Jamie Raskin currently represents Maryland's 8th congressional district, where I grew up in the House of Representatives, having first been elected to that position in 2017 after 3 terms in the Maryland State Senate, where he had a distinguished career. He was sworn into his 3rd term in Congress on January 3rd of this year, and he serves on a number of committees in the House, including the Judiciary Committee, the Rules Committee, and the Committee on Oversight and Reform. He was recently renamed chair of the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And of course, importantly for this conversation, he served as lead House manager for President Trump's 2nd impeachment trial. Congressman, thank you so much for being here with us today. General McCollum was just giving a quick overview for our viewers as to of the overall process of impeachment, just so people could be brought up to speed. What I would love for each of you to do next is just say briefly what your roles, a little bit about your roles and how you came into those roles. Maybe Congressman Raskin, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm delighted to be with you guys. And hello to Mr. McCollum. What a pleasure it is to be on with you as well. So is it all right if I start with just a couple general words about impeachment and the role that I think it plays, and then what's different in impeachment from an ordinary trial?
That would be perfect.
Is that all right? Well, so impeachment, of course, is the ultimate constitutional remedy that the people have and the people's representatives have in Congress for a president who runs amok and defies the rule of law and tramples the Constitution. And our founders, of course, had a great fear of presidential tyranny. When the Articles of Confederation were written, we didn't even have a president or an executive branch, and that was added from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, because we needed somebody to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. You needed it for energy and efficiency in the administration of the people's laws. But Congress always remained in Article 1, and it is Congress that has the power to regulate commerce internationally and domestically, and it's Congress that has the power to declare war. It's Congress that has the power to go after pirates, regulate intellectual property, you name it. And the president's core job is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And if he doesn't do it, in Section 4 of Article 2, it says that he shall be impeached if he commits treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which George Mason defined as great offenses, political offenses against the Republic. And we, of course, were conceived in revolutionary insurgency against a king who abused the rights of the people. That's not what we wanted. And so there is constitutional significance in the fact that we in Congress, in the House of Representatives, have the sole power to impeach a president, and the Senate has the sole power to try and convict a president, but the president has no power to impeach or convict Congress. I mean, just to think about that simple asymmetry. We have the power to get rid of a president who violates the rule of law, but our founders reposed a lot more wisdom in large groups of people than in a single person who might grow mad with power. So having said that, the trick in an impeachment trial, which I learned as being the lead manager in the 2nd Trump impeachment, is that the jurors are also the judges. The 100 senators both are the deciders of fact, like we think of as usually what a jury does. They are also the deciders of questions of law, of the admission of evidence, the jurisdiction to hear the case, any constitutional question that comes up. So they've got a lot of power. It's true that in the case of the sitting president, the Chief Justice of the United States must sit because they don't want a vice president presiding over the trial of a sitting president. Obviously, there's a structural conflict of interest there. But here it was a former president, so it was the president of the Senate in this case. The president pro tem of the Senate, Patrick Leahy, who was the senator from Vermont, who sat. I just think that we obviously presented overwhelming evidence of the president's guilt for inciting the violent insurrection and also the attempted coup that was built into that insurrection. And usually we think of coups as something being perpetrated against a president. This was a coup being perpetrated by the president against the vice president, Mike Pence, and against the Congress. There was overwhelming evidence, and everybody saw it. I mean, it was the most bipartisan impeachment vote in American history, 57-43. But Senator McConnell spoke for, if not all of the leftover Republicans, a lot of them, when he said he thought that Donald Trump was singularly, morally, and practically responsible, but he didn't think that the Senate had the jurisdiction to try a president who had already left office, which was an issue that we had decided on the first day of trial in a 54-46 vote, where the Senate determined that there was jurisdiction. Now, in a regular courtroom, if somebody is, say, charged with bank robbery, and then they bring two procedural motions, one to say that there's no jurisdiction of them because they came from out of state, and say another saying that the gun was illegally seized from them, the court would rule, well, is there in personam jurisdiction? Is there personal jurisdiction over him? Yes, of course there is. We reject that. And two, were his Fourth Amendment rights violated in seizing the gun? No, we don't think they were. You set those jurisdictional and constitutional questions aside, and you say, now we go to the facts. And then the jury decides, they're instructed to decide solely based on the facts. Well, what we had is a situation, we went all the way through the trial. McConnell, who ends up voting to acquit, says, yes, on the facts, he's guilty, but I don't think we had jurisdiction to try it, which we had already decided, in which in a normal courtroom would be something completely improper for him to cite. And so you see the frustration on the part of at least the House of Representatives, is not on the part of the American people. You have jurors who are also playing judges who simply refuse to forget a defeated constitutional or jurisdictional motion. But having said all that, I think that we convicted, in this case, Donald Trump in the court of public opinion, in the eyes of history. And I'm just sorry that we didn't get 10 more senators to join the 57 who said he was clearly guilty. I think that the American politics and government would be in a very different place today.
Thank you so much for that framing, and also for you anticipated some of the questions that we were probably going to get about how this trial is different from other trials. I mean, just one kind of follow-up for you about the nature of the Senate as a jury, and for you too, General McCollum. In a normal trial in a court of law, there would be jury instructions, and the goal, of course, of the jury instructions is to both help focus the jury on the questions that they need to decide, but also help set the boundaries for what are things that are no longer on the table for them to decide, questions like jurisdiction. So I'm curious, how was there an opportunity, other than your summations and your closing arguments, were there other opportunities to try to kind of establish guardrails for how the Senate would respond to the evidence that had been presented in both of your cases? Maybe we'll start with you, Senator Raskin, or Representative Raskin, but then also move to General McCollum after that.
Well, it's a great question. Of course, the Senate adopted a resolution defining the rules of the trial in advance. And of course, you can understand why they do that. At any time, they could amend the rules. At any time, they could proceed by unanimous consent or by a vote of the majority to alter the rules. I mean, I had a couple of things that I wanted to bring up at the beginning before we even started. And one was, I really objected to the seating of the senators by partisan composition. I did not think they should be seated according to Democrats here and Republicans there. I mean, when have you ever seen a jury in real life that sits according to political party registration? But I was told by both sides, I'm not blaming this just on the Republicans. I mean, I was told by the Democrats, well, that's not just done. Everybody wants to sit at their own table. Everybody wants to sit at their own desk. This is how we sit. And they just said this would not be a good way to introduce Professor Raskin to the Senate to make them move from their seats, which of course had been ransacked and rifled by the Ramshorn guy and the other insurrectionist marauders who had occupied the Senate chamber. So I think that they were feeling a little possessive and territorial about their seats. But I do think that it's a really serious problem. I mean, the reason why political parties all around the world sit according to party is so that they can maintain discipline and peer pressure, and that's precisely what you don't want in a jury. They've all sworn an oath to render impartial justice. They should be seated alphabetically or randomly. They should not be seated by partisanship. I also wanted to move for a secret ballot because I kept hearing from senators, including especially Republicans, that, well, on a secret ballot, you would win this thing 80 or 90, but there's just too much fear and terror among the Republicans that they'll have somebody running against them. Trump will come against them. And so they're able to maintain that kind of partisan thinking, which is the opposite of what the framers of the Constitution were looking for here.
I'd love to hear from you on kind of how you tried to set the ground rules for the jury, the Senate jury that you were in front of, and kind of how you saw that process play out.
Sure. Well, first of all, I was on the Judiciary Committee in the U.S. House in 1998 when President Clinton was impeached, and we went through the whole process. Wound up, all more articles were recommended. We had, first of all, we've been fortunate enough to have a special independent counsel. That statute's been changed and isn't around anymore, but we had a long investigation and lots of material and a whole long process of hearings of our own based upon the delivery of the report of that counsel. And then we concluded what we did as a committee, sent the several articles to the floor of the House, two of which, one on perjury, accusing the president of committing perjury before a federal grand jury, and one on obstruction of justice. All of this pertained to his affair with Monica Lewinsky, or his relationship with her, and a civil trial that had been going on by an accuser named Paula Jones, that he had actually done things improper with her some time ago, and his testimony in that trial and so on. Anyway, laying that groundwork a little bit, my role then shifted. I became an impeachment manager, much like Congressman Raskin, but I was not the person who was in charge of that particular thing. It was Henry Hyde, Congressman Hyde. He did, however, give me some major assignments. Initially, I was assigned to prepare the witnesses. This sounds strange because did we have witnesses? Does the Senate allow them? Was something of debate. But I did go to the interview. I set up an interview with Monica Lewinsky, with her counsel. The congressman who did eventually examine her for a videotape interview was present, as were a couple of others. And I thought that might be my role. We had quite a few of us who were impeachment managers. But then Henry Hyde decided that he needed me to do more. And I wound up taking a lead role in, if you will, prosecuting the case. I opened for an hour with all the facts. I did a lot of discussion. I had 3 different segments. An hour is a long time, 15 minutes and 5 minutes to close, all of those being stretched out. Now, having said that, the Clinton impeachment trial was different in that we were dealing with real crimes. So the question of high crime and misdemeanor was hardly in doubt. The question whether or not the president committed to perjury, whether or not there was obstruction of justice, as a matter of fact, whether or not the Senate wanted to remove, whether or not the Senate would have witnesses. At the end of the day, they made their own decisions, and I learned a lot. They have complete power and control, like the congressman said, and it was such that in this trial, which took place in January of 1999, there were no live witnesses. As Senator Lott said, he didn't want to sully the floor of the Senate with the presence of Monica Lewinsky. We all thought that was outrageous, just like I think you, Congressman, think some of the things they did in the Senate were in this trial, most recently with President Trump. And but we did get 2 or 3, including her, in videotape. But there was no cross-examination. There was no opportunity to really bring a witness in and do the type of thing that you do in a regular trial. Interestingly enough, at the end of the day, the vote in the Senate was 45 to 55 not to impeach on the perjury count. And it was a 50-50 tie when it came to the obstruction of justice. History doesn't record those kind of things. It's sort of like, well, we didn't win, so all it counts is what happened. We did have a very strong vote for this. The evidence was quite clear. And afterwards, I did have occasion to talk to some of the senators. And I know for a fact that a number of them voted the way they did against the impeachment, simply because they didn't want to do it. The public opinion wasn't strong enough. So I would say that one of the things that, Congressman, you've ran into and all of us knew is the state of public opinion. In the case of the trial you were doing, it's my opinion, that it happened very quickly. There were a lot of Americans who felt it was rushed. There was a reason why you had to do it. Many felt that it was very obvious that the president committed the crime, if you will, the charge you made against him about inciting violence and insurrection. But there were a lot of Americans who, A, didn't think it was fair, the process, and B, they didn't believe that he actually did the inciting. And that, of course, is factual. And I believe, and this is my opinion generally about impeachment trials, that for the Senate to convict, there has to be an overwhelming and generally bipartisan view that the president did something really bad and that he should be removed from office. And the public has to be behind it. No president's been removed. I was very close with Andrew Johnson, and it's certainly true that he could have been. But since then, in modern times, with the efforts with Trump and the one with Clinton, there was not sufficient public support, in my opinion. But again, the rules are so much so that the Senate could just decide pretty much what it wants to do.
Yeah, you mentioned, both of you mentioned how an impeachment really is like two trials. There's the trial on the merits, but then there's the trial in the court of public opinion. And I'm interested, Congressman Raskin, this idea of secret ballot. And for both of you, of course, you had a jury that was weighing how their vote would look, in addition to what they thought was the right vote. And if you were to go back and do it again, are the reforms you would want to try to, are the rules you would want to really push forward to make sure that future impeachments can be shielded a little bit from the court of public opinion? Of course, it's impossible because we're dealing with the president. But just things that would enable senators to really vote their conscience.
Well, let's see. I would go back to those two things I mentioned before. One is that I think there should just be general seating rather than partisan seating. And two, when I raised the question of a secret ballot, it was because there was so much political pressure being brought down on senators, on all sides, but especially on the Trump side. I mean, we know that. And in fact, a number of the senators were meeting regularly and admitted they were, and were seen meeting regularly with Trump's lawyers because Trump was very unhappy with the performance of his lawyers. And so the idea was to coach them through the week. But in any event, I think the secret ballot would alleviate some of that political pressure, but also violent threats. I mean, this, of course, was after the worst act of mass violence committed against the U.S. Capitol since the War of 1812 in 1813, and the biggest threat to the Republic since the Civil War. There were numerous people who were killed in the violence. And there were 140 Capitol officers and Metropolitan Police Department officers who were wounded or injured, broken noses, broken jaws, lost fingers, traumatic brain injuries, serious respiratory issues because of the toxic irritants that were brought by the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, other extremist groups. And there were lots of threats. I mean, and of course, all the impeachment managers knew about it because we had tons and tons of threats that were coming down against us, but there were threats against senators, but especially Republican senators who it was feared might, defect from the Trump orthodoxy, and 7 of them did. I mean, it was pretty remarkable. It was the most bipartisan vote to convict in American history, where we had Republican senators from New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the South, the Midwest, the West, Alaska, who joined every single Democrat. But it wasn't quite enough. It was a big majority, 57 to 43. I mean, that's a 14 vote difference, but we didn't get to 67. I mean, some people have suggested that given the state of partisanship in the country, that maybe you could never get to 67. I mean, we've never gotten to 2/3 in U.S. history. I mean, and it's hard to think of a more quintessential high crime and misdemeanor than waging war and insurrection against your own government in order to overthrow a presidential election. Nobody formally challenged anyway the idea that this was a high crime and misdemeanor. I mean, everybody agreed that if a president incited a violent insurrection, it would be a high crime and misdemeanor. The only question was, did Trump do it? And again, we don't think they offered any evidence to suggest he didn't do it. They just said, well, some of his whereabouts at certain points were unknown, but it was very clear, even after he was perfectly aware of the violence, that he kept inciting and egging on the attacks against Mike Pence and the attacks against the Congress. And even today, of course, as we predicted, continues to celebrate January 6th. Never forget this day. We love you. You're very special. All those kinds of messages against people who were beating up our police officers with steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, and so on. So, I guess I would just say it's a disappointing thing. I think we certainly disappointed the framers' highest expectations for what the Senate would act like and how it would behave. But in some sense, we fulfilled their expectations about the dangers of partisan faction. We just were not able to escape the idea that this was just a contest between 2 political parties as opposed to an assault against the republic.
Well said. Yeah, Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I haven't addressed it yet, and I will very briefly. Jamie, I don't think that this was an insurrection that he incited, and the incitement itself is the question. I don't know how each senator thought, and I realize this is impeachable. I wouldn't argue that if the president incited violence and encouraged the people and said, go up to the Capitol and go in there and break it open and go in there and stop Pence from counting the votes physically, that would be a different story. But listening to the speech itself he was giving when he gathered the crowd and all the circumstances that are there, I never was convinced. Certainly not if it had been tried in a court of law. Of course, the court of law would be the rules of evidence. You have to be beyond a reasonable doubt, that type of thing. That's not the way you work impeachment trials. So you don't decide that way. But on wearing my hat as a former trial lawyer and having defended criminal cases, I would say I had a very good case to defend the president on the facts. But having said that, the other thing that was disturbing to me about that trial was before it, the preliminary part of it, there was no opportunity for the president and his people to present their defense. There was no opportunity for them to do it in the House, in hearings, and there was no opportunity for the president to really present anything except for, hey, you want to come down here and talk to us yourself, which is not the way it normally is. Now, did he have counsel? Yes, he did. He was represented on the floor. But it was, I think, a sense of whether that was fair or not. But let me just come back and comment on this. At the end of the day, this is a political process. It is an important political process written in the Constitution by our founding fathers, who realized there need to be a method to remove, but they were going to make it very hard. And they did. Could they foresee all of these things? Probably not. But at some point, these senators, and mostly the Senate in this case, they have a big open space to decide how they're going to do these things. And they're trying to decide on the basis of their conscience. I'll give you one illustration from the trial of Bill Clinton. I was sitting at a football game with my former Senator Bob Graham, who's still living. I'm not going to say anything bad about him because I like him. He's a personal friend. He was sitting next to me, and we had just had Trent Lott make this comment. It was in whatever day that bowl game was, that maybe there wouldn't be any live witnesses on the floor of the Senate. He said, Bill, I can't imagine that. It's impossible. You can't really have a trial. You can't do this. We've got to have live witnesses. He's sitting there bringing the subject up to me at the football game in Miami. And then a few days later, he joined all Democrats in voting against witnesses, and of course some Republicans. There was a little backroom deal talking about getting together, not in the public eye. The senators, I'm sure, did it in your trial too, Congressman. They go huddle. I don't know if they huddle together as Democrats or Republicans or whatever, but they did in our case. They had Republican caucuses several times. They had Democrat caucuses, and then the senators caucused together. And we never knew what they were talking about. Well, we did sort of, but there's no record of this. And they were making these kind of decisions, what they thought was, quote, in our case, best for the country. We want to get rid of this trial. We want to get this subject matter off. We don't think that people really want to kick a popular president out of office in the case of Bill Clinton. And this is how we're going to do it. That's really what was going on in the back room. So I think this is something the public has to understand, that you can't take all the politics out of an impeachment trial, but it's important. I always thought that it was important, and I'm sure you do too, Congressman, that the House impeached President Clinton. I was absolutely convinced, I am to this day, that he committed the crimes. If he had been an ordinary citizen and committed the perjury, the lying under oath in front of a grand jury, he would have gone to court, gone to trial, not only been convicted, he would have gone to prison. And that happened in the District of Columbia, and there were any number of cases the Washington Post wrote about, when people were saying to me at the time, well, nobody goes to prison for perjury. Well, of course they do. And anyway, and lying under oath is not something the justice system can tolerate. So we talked a lot about the rule of law. We had a great forum. We aired it. You did too. You aired it all, and you're still full of it, as I am on my trial. I'm years away from it. But it is political at its heart when the Senate tries.
And the calling of witnesses, that we saw that with the 2020 impeachment too. There's the vote to block the calling of witnesses in that impeachment, and of course, Bill Clinton's charge involves his testimony under oath, and yet we didn't have Donald Trump's testimony under oath. I'm just curious, Congressman Raskin, if you can talk a little bit about the kind of the process around deciding. This is a question from the audience. Why President Trump was not asked to testify under oath at any point. I'm sure there were a lot of reasons on both for that.
Good. Well, he was invited to testify under oath by me. I sent him a letter a week before the trial, saying, "You have denied. You didn't just come back and say there's no jurisdiction to try me." He came back and he said that, but then he started denying everything. He denied that he had incited violence. He had denied that he was involved in telling people to come to Washington. Just flat out lies. Speaking of lying, and I agree with Mr. McCollum that lying is very serious, whether you're lying about sex or oral sex, or whether you're lying about whether you incited a violent insurrection against your country. Lying is very important, when you're president, whether you're under oath or not under oath. And a lot of presidents avoid going under oath because they tell hundreds of lies or thousands of lies. But integrity and honesty are essential to our form of government. I agree, by the way, that Clinton could have been tried and should have been tried for perjuring herself. You don't have a right to not lie about sex under oath. But I do think that does not rise to the great and momentous crimes against the Republic that George Mason and James Madison were talking about, which is why I would have opposed that. But in any event, if you do think that's a great and momentous crime of the Republic, you've got to believe that inciting a violent insurrection against the government is a great and momentous crime. I mean, this is like the paradigm offense, is to try to provoke insurrection or coup or civil war against your own government. But let me just make one other point about that, because Congressman McCollum makes the point about the standard of proof, saying, well, in a court of law, it would be beyond a reasonable doubt if we were trying him for the statutory crime of, say, inciting a riot or seditious conspiracy. That's absolutely true. But that's not what the founders wanted for impeachment. What the founders wanted for impeachment was the president of the United States to maintain his oath of office. And so Donald Trump would not have spent 30 seconds in jail after being impeached and convicted. It's not a criminal process. It's about, as Madison said, protecting the Republic. It's about what are the standards of behavior we're going to demand of our public officials. And so when I addressed that at the trial, I said, you can consider it beyond a reasonable doubt because we think we win on that. You can consider it civil, which I think is the way it's generally been considered, a preponderance of the evidence, or you can consider it the way I think about it, which is what Tom Paine said, use your common sense. If he changed the date of the demonstration to January 6th and he made it right at 1 o'clock and he told everybody, I'm going to be with you and I'm marching there with you, and you got to fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, and if you don't show strength, you're not going to have a country anymore. And there's no plans for anybody to do anything. There's no music, there's no speeches, there's no microphones. They're just going to the Capitol. And the theme of the rally is stop the steal. And he's tweeting against Mike Pence, telling him that morning, you're going to be a pussy or a patriot. Yes, I think that is overwhelming on any standard of proof you want to think of, that he did it, that he incited a violent insurrection against the Union. Can you imagine George Washington doing that? Can you imagine George Bush doing that? Can you imagine Barack Obama doing that? I mean, come on, so forgive me, Congressman McCollum, but, like you're saying, these things don't leave you that quickly. And unlike Bill Clinton, who is not still a threat to the Republic, I believe Donald Trump is. I believe that, he continues to go out and lie and spread his big lie, claiming that Joe Biden is not the rightful president. We've never seen anything like that in American history, even through the Civil War. I mean, it's an extremely dangerous thing for an entire major political party to set itself outside the constitutional order and be attacking the results of valid elections. They brought lawsuits in 61 different state and federal courts, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they lost every time. We have a meticulous, comprehensive, documentary record that his big lie is just a lie. It's a fantasy, and it's amazing to me that Lincoln's party, or not all of it, because we've got Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney, and we've got Adam Kinzinger, but the rest of them are willing to indulge that kind of lying. And that's why I'm disappointed in the final outcome and in what Senator McConnell did, because he knew it and he said it, that Donald Trump was factually accountable and responsible for what happened. But he said we didn't have jurisdiction, in the case, even though we had decided that issue on day one. Forgive me for filibustering here. I yield back.
Yeah, both of you, of course, were deeply involved in recent history of impeachment. And so we now have new examples of what might be considered by one group or another as a high crime and misdemeanor. I am curious if one of you can, or both of you can weigh in on kind of what was the sense of history you were following when you were thinking about what's impeachable? Because impeachable, although it's happened a lot in the last 5 years, it's meant to be a very rare tool, and Bill, maybe we'll start with you. What was the history you all were leaning on when you decided to draw up the articles of impeachment? And we should talk, both of you, about the articles of impeachment and how much that really sets the trajectory for what gets discussed in the following trial. But Bill, what were you drawing on in the history of impeachment? Because up until that point, it was exceedingly rare.
All of us on the Judiciary Committee in the House, as we reviewed everything that we had overwhelming evidence that was presented by the independent counsel, were worried about the rule of law. We were worried about the judicial system. I remember we're the Judiciary Committee. And beyond that, I personally believe that, if not the most, I think it should be considered the most important pivotal instrument of our government is the independent judiciary and the rule of law. And it depends upon the faith of the public largely in the rule of law. For people to abide by it. No, most Americans don't realize it, but we have a unique judicial system. It's not replicated elsewhere in the world. And most of the places in Latin America and Asia and lots of other countries, there's an enormous amount of corruption. Judges are bribed and people don't have faith in their courts. So when the President of the United States, the top officer of the country, is not being held at the same standard that Joe Sixpack would be held in lying under oath in a court of law or in obstructing justice and all these things that we thought were egregious, then that tears down the fabric of faith and the very system of justice that's required to keep our freedoms. Without the Supreme Court, it's the balance. It's the things you learn in school, checks and balances, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive. And that's why we have all this. And if you tear down the judicial, you've torn down an enormous amount of what makes this country work. So that's what was motivating me. And I will say this, that while I've got the opportunity, that I believe that the trial that Congressman Raskin did was more likely to be a violation of being a high crime and misdemeanor, and it was a serious matter. Whether I agreed that he had the facts and that the president actually incited, that's an opinion of fact, not of law. The previous impeachment of the president that I was involved with earlier, dealing with matters over in Ukraine and so on, that was almost farcical in my opinion. Now, we don't have to debate that. That's not what he tried, but that didn't have, in my opinion, any high crime or misdemeanor, and it wasn't even really close. And so that would have been, to my way of thinking, if you want to juxtapose this, the one example of something where you might have wanted to ask them, why did they really go forward with that? There was always a desire to kick Trump out of office. There's this huge political thing that we don't have time today to go into about what motivates why does President Trump have all these great supporters. And by the way, I'm not a tremendous supporter of President Trump. I have never been. I have voted for him instead of President Biden, and I voted for him in the previous election, but I didn't vote for him in the primaries, and I voted for him because I liked his policies. And it was very difficult for me, some of his behavior has been. But I must say that I really think that most Americans don't follow this in that kind of detail. They're moved by a lot of emotion. So I'm glad you're having this discussion today and give me a chance and Jamie a chance to explain the rationale that we feel personally about why we did this.
You know, and one thing that kind of comes out of what your answer there, Bill, is in terms of how we manage the emotions on all sides, and the way in which these trials are broadcast is just so different. I mean, I remember Bill Clinton's trial was appointment television on all broadcast networks. We no longer have that kind of shared broadcast network experience in our political world. People have their own networks that they cling to, and I'm just curious, to have tried Bill Clinton again.
I've lost your sound.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Yeah, we don't have you. We see your picture, but we don't. And your lips aren't moving. We lost your sound.
Well, let me take the opportunity to respond to something interesting that Bill said, because I do think that the problem of partisanship underlies so much of our difficulty with this. And when Bill said, there's an effort to impeach Trump or a desire to impeach Trump from the beginning, I plead guilty to that. I mean, I think, and I happen to agree with a lot of what he said about the Ukraine prosecution, which at the very least was extremely complicated and intricate, and I don't think most people could follow it. But I felt that Donald Trump was in violation of the emoluments clauses, both the foreign and the domestic emoluments clauses, from day one of being in office, when he said he was going to stay in business and continue to collect millions of dollars from foreign governments and so on. But I don't want to prosecute that case here. But I plead guilty to that. It is also the case that there were Republicans who were calling for Bill Clinton's head from the very beginning. I think Bill would acknowledge that. That's what the Whitewater investigation was about. I mean, what you guys ended up impeaching him on was not how the Whitewater investigation started. But remember, Ken Starr was brought in as a special prosecutor, and there was a whole report. And it was like, I mean, from our perspective, it was a wild goose chase that ended up with the inescapable, which is Bill Clinton, a man of some insatiable appetites, got nailed for his sex life, basically. I mean, that's the way the public at least saw it. And so there we go. We do have to overcome at least the idea that our people in our party can never be guilty of anything, including inciting a violent insurrection against the government, when they're indicted by their own language, their own words, and their own organizing, come to Washington for a wild protest. I mean, what president of the United States even talks like that? And now he's resisting even cooperating with an investigation. If he had nothing to do with it, why is he trying to stop everybody from testifying? So I just think that right now we're talking about the security, the safety, and the future of the Republic. And there are Republicans who are saying this is a bridge way too far for me. I'm off of it. And so we've got a bipartisan January 6th investigative committee, but it's coming under partisan attack, and essentially because of Donald Trump. And so I don't know. I'm glad to hear, Congressman McCollum, because you've got such a wonderful reputation, that you don't identify with following whatever Donald Trump is saying. But I have colleagues who do. If Donald Trump got up and he said, "This is called a patriot mask, I'm going to put it on, and everybody wear a patriot mask, and if you don't, you're an agent of the Chinese Communist Party," they'd all be wearing masks right now, and they'd be beating up people who don't have masks on. I mean, so I don't even think that, I don't think that there's critical thinking left among the people who are following Donald Trump. And that to me is just a scary thing for the Republic. And I don't care that much about my political party to go out and lie about these things.
Jamie, let me respond a little bit because it's a broader question, but having served, I've been out of office 20 years, doesn't seem possible, but I served 20 years in the U.S. House. And I believe that we had so much more comedy between the two parties that you can do business, even if you didn't agree. And today, for redistricting reasons or because of the internet or whatever it is, my impression from my colleagues and from some of them who are Democrats is that we have a situation where there's a fear on a sizable percentage of both parties' congressmen that they'll get primaried and they won't win their primary if they are seen as having crossed the line and been not just a Donald Trump question, but to Nancy Pelosi or to Joe Biden or to President Obama, on your party's side, or whatever the cause is. If you go too far over, you're not recognized anymore. And leave me an example. When I was in Congress, I was chairman of the crime subcommittee at the end. I served on that subcommittee for many years, and I was the immigration subcommittee. Well, the two people I worked most closely with throughout all of that were Barney Frank and Chuck Schumer. And Barney's gone now, but I did a deal with Barney. I did Senator Simon. It was done when the Democrats were in control. People told me I couldn't do it. I had to get unanimous consent. We all worked it out. It was it was a significant immigration bill. I don't know if it could be done today. Secondly, I believe that if I went to Chuck Schumer and I were in Congress today, and he went along with something I proposed, which he did, and I went along with some things he proposed, the chances are he wouldn't be the leader in the Senate any longer. And I'm using that with your party, but it's the same with mine. And so those things are an impediment. It's a huge gap we as a country sorely need to overcome. And that affects, I think, people, and in fact, perhaps your impeachment trial. It's not just the personality of Donald Trump. It's not just the situation we're in with him. There's a bigger picture issue here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right about that. Our party, of course, now, and we're showing it with the Build Back Better debate. If anything, it's the herding cats phenomenon. It's flying off in a lot of different directions. I'd see a lot more discipline and control within the Republican caucus, but I just think it's all wasted on Donald Trump. Do you know what I mean? It's like, how can we proceed? And I ask you this in all sincerity. How can we proceed as a constitutional democracy if we have a political party which refuses to accept the results of an election and tries to discredit the election? And 61 courts have rejected every claim of corruption and fraud. That's the real problem. You were talking about respect for the judiciary in the context of perjury. You were saying we've got to respect what the judiciary says. Well, the judiciary spoke on that, and Donald Trump went right past it. And all of these people followed him off on the ledge. And so we're in a situation where they're concocting new investigations to relitigate things that were already decided by courts. Those continue to fail too. And they reject even those, like the one in Arizona. So, I mean, please tell me what I can be doing in terms of talking to my Republican colleagues to get beyond this.
Well, for one thing, I agree with you. And I've studied this. I've had reason, which don't have time to go into today, and we're far afield maybe from what Johns Hopkins wants to be talking about. But the reality is that I agree with you, and that there was no fraud that would overturn the election in any of those states. There was fraud, however. I mean, there's always fraud in elections, and there were problems that were there. And I think, on the other hand, your party has been overreactive because of that, because of Trump, to some very constructive legislation that some of the states have put forward. And it's not all voter suppression, and a lot of politics gets into that. So I'm in a position I can take my hat off a little bit here. I'm not in office, and say, there's a problem that's fundamental, and I can see it all along the way. We need to have free and fair elections. We need to have civil rights supported. We need to get the personalities out of it, but it's hard to do. So sometime you and I ought to talk about it. I'd be glad to personally talk to you.
Yeah.
I think going back and forth among the individuals is very, very important. And you are doing some of it. I know you are, but it's much more difficult now than it was when I was in Congress. Now, I
Yeah,
don't know if our host is back in here or not, or we're going to carry the last 10 minutes because.
Can you all hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, and also let me just say to the audience, we are open for your questions at any time. So we welcome those. Sorry that my audio cut out for a second. One question about the tool, about the impeachment tool, bringing it back to that tool. It's clear, but both in the case of President Clinton and the case of President Trump, that there was a hunger for accountability for misdeeds. We can argue the nature of those deeds, but if impeachment stops being a tool that's effective, and both of you saw the frustrations, are there other tools that Congress can wield, or other tools that the framers had in mind that could really help prevent executive overreach, that either aren't being used or that Congress could introduce?
Well, let me take the first shot at that one. First of all, the impeachment has not been a failure. Impeachment has worked both in the case Bill's been talking about and the case I've been talking about. Both those presidents were impeached. They weren't convicted. The problem comes over in the Senate side with the 2/3 requirement. I mean, Donald Trump, 57 of 100 senators said he did it. That exists as a legislative and parliamentary fact. But he did beat the constitutional spread, you might say, of 2/3. So, I mean, I think that's something that we could discuss. Maybe the magic number 60, which is what they use for filibusters for some reason in the Senate, maybe that's a better way to think about it. But of course, I don't know whether there would be any appetite to look at that question. Maybe 2/3 is just too difficult given human nature and given what partisanship is. But I look, you can use the purse strings, you can use litigation and so on, but basically it's going to require Congress to try to bring this extreme partisanship and even kind of, cult-like authoritarianism under control. Congress has got to speak for the people vigorously, but there are these anti-democratic instruments that are preventing the majority from speaking and governing, like the filibuster, like the gerrymandering of our congressional districts, like the way the Electoral College is now being manipulated. It's a very dangerous thing. We're going to have to, at the very least, reform it, if not just go to a national popular vote, because every nook and cranny now is going to become a referendum on who you really support. That's another gift of Donald Trump to American government and politics. I mean, things we used to take for granted, like you just accept what the electors are. You don't try to turn the vice president into a political actor. Those things are suddenly all up for grabs.
Well, the divisions in the country right now, politically, from a philosophical standpoint, and from maybe that's a strong word because people don't always think philosophically they're moved by emotion, but the differences between them are stronger now. And I believe that's a problem underlying all of this that we aren't discussing is a bigger issue than today's topic. But it is important to recognize that, the Democrat majority, not everybody, has moved considerably, the progressives have, to the left, much farther left than the majority of Democrats in the Congress when I was president. And the Republicans have been bedded down very hard. And when you go to the elections and you go into the primaries, it's hard to find any middle ground in the primaries. So I don't know, maybe a number of Democrats and a number of Republicans have more moderate views. And we're not talking about President Trump now, we're talking about issues. But if they express them, they wouldn't get nominated. They wouldn't get renominated. And so we're in a polarized period that goes far beyond the question of the structures you just described. I don't favor tampering with a lot of these things, like the 2/3 necessary for impeachment, or, did I one time think we ought to do away with the filibuster? Yeah, you could argue you could. And then everybody would be a free for all. And we would have real referendum elections on the president because you would have one party going and enacting, if they control everything for a little while, everything they wanted. And then the other party would try to go take it all back and dismantle it, and they get in. And I think there's always been some balance that's been struck. And now I've become convinced over the years that the filibusters is an important tool. But if you look at where we are today as a nation, we're tribal. There's too much identity politics, and I'm not talking just about language of one party or another. There are problems for that, and maybe we'll overcome it, but it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of leadership. People, I just had a reunion this past weekend, 20 members of the 54 members of the Reagan Republican freshman class. And one of the big topics of that was how many of the ones who were freshmen in 1981 and 82 made votes for things that were very unpopular. And they did it knowing they were likely to lose in a primary, or not a primary, in a general election in 1982's election. And they did, and several of them were back. And they said they'd do it all over again. That's a gutsy leadership. That's a gutsy position. And I'd like to see more of that. Not that I want to sacrifice people, but you elect people to Congress, I think you do, to decide what they're going to do, not to put their finger in the wind. And too many of my colleagues, when I was there, and I think way too many today, are putting their finger to the wind, largely because of the redistricting, the primaries.
What do you both see ahead? I mean, we have a question from the audience about just, the nature of the high crime and misdemeanor that you tried, Congressman Raskin. Are we going to see more of that? And both of you are lawyers as well. And, there's a view out there that if you fail to convict somebody, that the lesson they learn is they should try again. What are your views as to how we go down the next election? Irrespective of who's running, are there guardrails that we should be putting in place now so that we don't even have to resort to impeachment?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to distinguish between what I call the insurrection and the coup. I mean, I saw 3 rings of activity on January 6th. One was the massive people who were brought in by Donald Trump's tweets, many of whom were just regular citizen protesters who supported Trump, but those protesters were turned into rioters. The next level in was what I call the insurrection, and that was the Aryan Nations, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Proud Boys, the militia groups, the QAnon followers, who were literally training for the attack and figured out where the building could be breached and entered. They broke the windows. They were the ones who started, in most cases, the violence against the cops, which unfortunately so many other citizens got pulled into. But at the very center of it was the coup. And the whole point here was for, at the end, after all the court cases failed, after trying to browbeat Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia and other similarly situated election officials across country, after failing to get Republican state legislatures just to set aside popular elections and install slates of Trump electors, they decided that they were going to pin everything on Mike Pence. And all he had to do was something that had never before been done in U.S. history, in which he did not have the constitutional power to do, as he recognized and as he elaborated in a memo he issued on January 6th. They wanted him to reject the electors coming in from Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, lowering Biden's total below 270, kicking it into a contingent election under the 12th Amendment. The purpose of that was that under the 12th Amendment, we don't vote one member, one vote. We vote one state, one vote. And the GOP controlled 27 states. I don't believe Liz Cheney, who's the at-large rep from Wyoming, would have gone along with it, but they still had 26 states. And that was basically the plan. And the insurrection and the coup were coordinated. And that was a lot of what Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and other integral actors to it were trying to do. Will we see this again? I would say more than likely we will see it again in 2024. And it could be an exact replay of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, because Trump and his loyal lieutenants have been going around the country trying to replace Brad Raffensperger. They've got one of our colleagues, Jody Heiss, now running against Raffensperger. So anywhere somebody didn't follow the will of Donald Trump, they're trying to get rid of them and replace them. And of course, they're trying to essentially expel from the caucus those like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who want an honest reckoning with what actually happened with Trump's attack on democracy on that day. So I think we are in serious danger of this happening again. And we are going to try to speak to the vast majority of the American people who reject violence, who reject insurrection and coup, and want to have honest partisan competition on the issues and the policy, and not have political parties existing outside of the constitutional order and waging war against our elections.
Well, let me comment and say that I think that one of the things we see in your party and the Democrat Party are a lot of radical things going on as well. We haven't talked about them because they're not part of this particular January 6th deal. Those were, Proud Boys and whatever. But what I see is what happened last summer with the riots in various cities like Seattle and Portland. I see lawlessness that's out there on the streets. I see this movement to defund the police, or at least it's hurt them a lot. And we are having more violent crime and murder and so forth in our country than in years. I think we've got inherent problems coming along that could occur long before 2024. You also see the likelihood that we have a great many more organized crime figures from Latin America in here now. They come across the border anyway. There's more cocaine coming into our country each year, the last 3 years, than ever in history. We don't talk about it. We talk about opioids. I chaired that committee, so I follow it, and I'm amazed. But the drug cartels in Latin America are operating in the United States today. They're operating like they've never been. I was Attorney General of Florida. I know we had special, grand juries and prosecutions, and that's been 10 years ago. It's only gotten worse. So I think there's a lot more going on, and radical Islamists are a problem in this country. So we are going to see a great division. Let's say, for example, let's assume that, which you won't, but that the Republicans retake the U.S. House and perhaps have the Senate as well after this midterm election next year. And that's a real possibility. So if that happens, are they going to go and want to try to impeach President Biden? There's a very strong feeling in the party that he's incompetent, that he's not doing well. What he did in Afghanistan is a tragedy. And they just go on and on and on, not over policy, but over people. I'm not so sure that that's a good idea. Let him serve out his term. I mean, but a lot of people think the country and my party is going to come to an end. Basically, democracy is going to go away unless we do something about Biden now. And I'm not talking about insurrection. I'm talking about the reality of what's going on. So it is a problem, but it's more fundamental than just talking about what narrow area you're referring to with those who supported Trump.
Well, we are out of time, and just to say there is no doubt that divisions are very high, and I think one of the most important ways that we can demonstrate for the world our commitment to the contest of ideas is the way in which you two and other elected officials like you from across the aisle come together to make your case to each other and to our audiences, and to demonstrate a commitment to the rule of law and to the sense that we can have spirited disagreements, and all in the spirit of wanting to protect our constitutional democracy. So thank you to you both for your roles in trying to secure that. And I will turn it back over to Jamie or Camille.
And I've got to go.
To Jamie. Okay, Jamie.
Everybody, and thank you, Congressman McCollum, and thank you, Steve and Camille. Sorry, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, too. Thank you all.
That's okay. Thank you, everyone, for your time and talent. We really appreciate it. This was wonderful, and a true spirit of discourse and civility. I commend everybody for a great job. We hope that you enjoyed it. I will send a follow-up email with a recording of the program and a list of resources and our event schedule. And I do hope that you take some time with us again in the future. We've really enjoyed being with you. Any final words, anyone? Have a great day.
Thank you.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.